Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, many thanks, Robert, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to speak tonight alongside Charles. This is shrewd positioning because I can be relied upon to say essentially the same things as Charles while sounding somewhat more extreme, or dare I say it, swivel-eyed. Charles is a master of litotes, the art of meaning more by saying less. I cloak my essential reasonableness in neon. So be prepared tonight to undertake an exercise in conservative semiotics. This is the third speech that I've given over the years to the Bruges Group. The second was in London a few years ago, and I promise that you will soon get a text of it. The first, however, was on a more significant occasion. It took place the same week that Lady Thatcher was defenestrated from the leadership of the Conservative Party in a revolution led by her own cabinet. I came to that meeting, indeed, direct from Downing Street, where we were drowning our sorrows in that curious atmosphere of despairing hilarity that so often accompanies defeat and tragedy. But the atmosphere I encountered at the Bruges Group that night was even stranger. It was complacency. Your members present, your predecessors, were so confident that the Tory party had fundamentally changed on the issue of Europe, so confident that any new leader would be compelled to adhere to the new Eurosceptic orthodoxy, that they regarded the disappearance of Mrs. Thatcher as a tragic but secondary phenomenon. My speech that evening was a passionate diatribe against that illusion. It was a warning that the defenestration of the lady was part of a wider coup over policy towards Europe, and that almost any new Tory leader, Major, Hurd or Heseltine, would be much more favourable than she to the European project. I think I was right. Indeed, John Major confirmed my view only days after his leadership victory by saying that he wanted to place Britain at the heart of Europe. But your predecessors had some truth on their side too. Eurosceptic opinion in the Conservative Party was clearly the majority opinion in 1990 and the following years. Boldly and ably represented at the Maastricht Conference by Michael Howard and Norman Lamont, it more or less compelled the then Prime Minister to insist on the opt-outs from the treaty, those opt-outs that historians may see as the start of a long march towards a variable geometry Europe. May see, I said, not will see. And of course, in the next 2 decades, the Tory Eurosceptics achieved such dominance in the party that any prospective party leader had to establish that he was one of us. The honourable exception is, of course, Ken Clarke. This victory involved many intra-party battles. It involved strong resistance from Heseltine and co. It required a firm and unwavering presentation of the Eurosceptic case from this society and from parliamentary heroes such as Bill Cash, who endured enormous condescension for their honesty and bravery, and we owe them a great deal. But we shared our complacency of that first night and fought the good fight, and I think it's fair to say that Euroscepticism has triumphed within the Tory party. But if we are honest, we must also say that 2 years ago, we were nowhere near changing this country's relationship with the European Union for the better, and we would not be anywhere near that today if it were not for the enormous boost we have received from the disaster of the euro and how the EU has handled that disaster. Consider first an important point. The euro disaster had to happen. It was baked in the cake, as they say. And here are 6 brief and compressed reasons for making that assertion. First, the euro locks the Mediterranean countries into a vertiginously unfavourable exchange rate. While they are in it, they will be locked into economic austerity without end. And Northern Europe will be locked into paying an endless flow of subsidies without end. That is a loss of wealth at both ends of the transfer. Long term, Greece, Italy, Spain and others will become one large mezzo-German, indefinitely. Second, the euro reflects a historicist belief in the inevitability of ever closer union that places it beyond rational second thoughts. One might have imagined that Europe had already suffered quite enough from the politics of historical inevitability in the 20th century. What purpose does it serve now and here? Not prosperity, not economic welfare. These are to be sacrificed in order to ensure that the inevitable actually happens. As an old-fashioned Anglo-Celt empiricist, I find this exchange of real wealth for the fool's gold of political prestige simply silly. Besides, as Keynes remarked, the unexpected always happens. The inevitable never. Third, the euro requires for it to function, the euro requires anti-democratic supports such as Angela Merkel's fiscal union. Backed incidentally by the British government, this is quite simply incompatible with democracy. If Ruritania's budget needs the approval of Brussels, then the sovereign power in Ruritania is the European Union, and Ruritania has ceased to be governed democratically in fiscal matters, which, as it happens, are about 90% of politics. But does not Ruritania enjoy pooled sovereignty or shared sovereignty with its European Union partners? Well, shared sovereignty creates a new sovereign power, namely the EU, and therefore deprives the previous sovereign power, namely Ruritania, of its authority. All assurances to the contrary are bogus and generally dishonest. But perhaps the point is best explained metaphorically. A bachelor is a sovereign power. A married man enjoys the benefits of shared sovereignty. Married men, obviously, are in the audience. Fourth, the policy can't actually be implemented. A government may agree to submit its budget for approval to Brussels. But how will the EU enforce a contrary judgment, one that the government or the electorate rejects? The behaviour of the Greek government over the last few months illustrates the point. Malcolm Muggeridge was fond of quoting the Guardian, the first line of the Guardian editorial, which ran, one is tempted to suppose that the Greeks do not want a stable government. Well, they certainly don't want a stable government imposed from the outside. Fifth, the policy encourages the political extremism that the European Union is supposed to have overcome. Governments in democracies cannot simply impose unpopular policies on their voters. They are even less able to do so when the policies are imposed on them from outside. And when they attempt to do so, they sow dragon's teeth in the form of extreme populist movements that promise to reject what the orthodox democratic parties have accepted. Until yesterday, I don't think anyone in this room had heard of Alexis Tsipras, the leader of the radical left party in Greece. He was an unknown. Today, he is inspiring leftist movements all over Europe and dragging more or less respectable social democrat parties back towards a policy of reckless spending, expropriation, and the fun anarchism of playwright Dario Fo, author of Can't Pay, Won't Pay. The sixth criticism explains the first five. The policy of installing a European economic government in order to sustain the euro would need to be rooted in a European demos, the European national identity, in order to survive. But that simply doesn't exist. And as long as the fiscal union lacks the demos to give its collective budgetary decisions democratic legitimacy, the prospect of a government endorsing Brussels' decision but finding itself unable to implement it in the face of popular opposition is a real likelihood. What then? What happens if the government agrees but the people won't go along? Send in the troops? Expel the recalcitrant people along with their compliant government? Impose a fine? Collect it how? The options are not very promising. Without a demos underpinning it, the euro and the European economic government that must underpin it can't work. It can't bridge the gap between Northern and Southern Europe. It can't be reconciled with the democratic government of member states. It can't actually be implemented against the popular opposition which it's bound to stir up. And it's doomed to be the unfulfilled historicist dream dreamt by a bureaucratic vanguard class of a European nation that doesn't yet exist and that may never exist. But it's created a major crisis. And given the extreme character of the crisis at this point, the best option for Euroland members is restructuring of the single currency, perhaps creating two single currencies, so to speak, a Northern Euro and a Southern Euro. that would give us the entertaining spectacle of watching President Hollande and the French establishment squirm horribly as they had to decide whether to join the Northern Euro for reasons of prestige or the Southern Euro for reasons of economic advantage. My prediction is that they will join the Northern Euro for reasons of prestige and suffer first economic disadvantage and then second the loss of prestige as a result of economic failure. But it will need several more crises and several more failed solutions before Brussels, Berlin and Paris accept a different inevitability from the one that they have proclaimed. And they have not yet given up on the calculation that the crisis can eventually be compelled to yield the ever closer economic union that they want. Indeed, we are told that the designers of the single currency knew in advance that it couldn't work, but that it would create a crisis that could then be exploited to create centralized financial and economic institutions that the member states would not otherwise accept. But I believe this is true, but it also prompts me to wonder, what was the actual plan they had in mind for when the crisis struck? Brussels' thinking on that seems to have been glimpsed in advance by the late Sir Noel Coward, who also, however, glimpsed its wondering what to do when the two spouses eventually catch up with the runaway couple, says, well, we shall have to rely on the inspiration of the moment. To which Eliot responds, it will be a moment completely devoid of inspiration. And that proved to be the case in the euro crisis. In the words of the Washington Post columnist Robert Samuelson, the euro has proved to be the biggest single public policy disaster since the Second World War. It was forced through against the popular wishes of most European electorates by their political elites. They remain wedded to it. Their collaborators in our own political elite remain wedded to it as well. Some even advocate joining it still. So, not only must we hold the architects and supporters of this catastrophe, this disaster, accountable for it, we must never fail to remind them of the catastrophic failure of judgment whenever they step forward to advocate some new extension of European competence. I don't always agree with Peter Osborne on everything, but he hit a whole carpenter's tool bag of nails squarely on the head in his book, The Guilty Man. Indeed, the current European crisis is so deep, so catastrophic, and so frightening that a certain excited complacency is beginning to be encountered once again among Eurosceptics. They, or we, feel that since the House of Cards is falling apart, we have a real opportunity to transform our relationship with the EU. In the immortal words of Tony Curtis in Operation Petticoat, in confusion there is profit. Since other European member states will need our help to restructure Europe and the euro at some point, we can draw up a list of non-negotiable demands, present them to Europe as the price of our agreement to the treaty revisions that they want. Indeed, today the Daily Mail presents one such list of demands. They seem reasonable enough to me, but when you look at the obstacles in the way of achieving them, it is clear that complacency on our part remains unjustified. Getting them accepted by the Tory half of the present government would be an achievement in itself. But we need also to get them accepted by the entire British government, by Brussels, and after any renegotiation, first by the European Court of Justice and afterwards by the German Constitutional Court. So we need to have a very clear idea of what we want and a clear strategy to achieve our aims. We can't simply blunder optimistically into this. And on this question of strategy and forward thinking, I want to make 4 points. The first is that while the debate is still at an early stage, and long before David Cameron shuttles off to any Brussels renegotiation, we must establish the absolute reasonableness of Britain leaving the European Union. That is absolutely clear. That may not be our intention, it may not be our policy, but it must be on the table as an alternative to any other European reform proposals we put forward, and as a clear possibility if our other proposals are rejected. Eurosceptics in this country must labour intellectually to make the case. Eurosceptics in Parliament must labour to ensure that the case becomes government policy. The case itself, by the way, is manifestly, almost hectoringly reasonable. I will outline it very briefly here because this audience knows it well, but here goes. It's not necessary to be in a trade bloc in order to trade with other countries. Most of our trade is already with countries outside the European Union. Considered as a market, the European Union will definitely grow more slowly than other global markets in the next 20 to 30 years. We have historical and cultural links likely to facilitate trade with those markets in Asia, North America, Latin America, and Australasia. And EU membership imposes heavy regulations on British industry that increase the costs of our exports to everyone. So much in the way for the trade argument. In addition, leaving the EU would eliminate the budgetary payments we make to Brussels. It would rescue us from the insane and insanely expensive common agricultural policy. It would enable us to regain our fisheries, to protect the London art market, to escape the EU's ridiculous and ridiculously costly energy policy, and to avoid a job-killing tax on the City of London without asking permission or making needless reciprocal concessions, and much else. Notably, regaining our democracy and becoming a self-governing people once again. Now, we would remain good friends and trading partners with European countries, but our foreign and trade policies would be dictated by our own interests rather than by the fiction of overriding joint Finno-Portuguese interests of which we have a 27th share. We would be cool, and could be cool, in our assessment of how much energy to devote to Europe with its coming crises of demography and identity, rather than the energy we might devote to the other parts of the world. Any cool and rational assessment would surely conclude that continuing integration into Europe is not a rational grand strategy for Britain, but an exercise in necrophilia. There is, however, an argument that makes me reluctant to, by the way, I was going to wouldn't have enough time here, but there are some responses made yesterday by Bill Emmett of the Times, which I would like to deal with in the full paper. There is, however, an argument that makes me reluctant to argue without any qualification for a British withdrawal. It is an argument rooted in the strength, economic strength, world influence and cultural power of this country, rather than in its apparent impotence, which is what the supporters of further integration tend to rely on. Anyone who lives abroad, as I have done for the better part of 30 years, quickly realizes that the caricature of this country as a washed-up, moth-eaten, toothless old bulldog is not taken seriously by anyone who is himself serious. We have fallen on hard times recently, thanks to the shallow and irresponsible policies of the Blair and Brown administrations. But in the longer perspective, we are seen generally and rightly as an unusually important and consequential nation with a disproportionate influence in world affairs and on international bodies. Indeed, we are seen as the nation that had a role second only to the United States in establishing the post-war institutions, both of international cooperation and of Western defense, everything from GATT to NATO. And if we were to simply withdraw from the European Union, it would strike quite an important blow to the edifice of post-Cold War institution building at a time when the world does not really does not want another blow to confidence. Please don't misunderstand me here. It might still be necessary to withdraw in our own interests. We should be prepared to do just that. But it is worth asking if there is not another step that might enable us to attain our objectives and yet also to reform Europe in ways that will be helpful to all its member states, and furthermore, in doing so, create a climate of great economic hope and possibility. For even if we succeed in solving the euro, we still have to deal with a series of unresolved problems and disputes in Europe. For instance, whether or not to grant Turkey full EU membership. Europe on this is divided between Germany and France, which fear free movement of labour for 70 million Turkish Muslims, and Britain and the Commission, which fear that a European no would drive Turkey further away from the West and into dangerously Islamist adventures. Then there are the unsettled problems with Ukraine and Georgia, both suspended uneasily between a resurgent Russia and an uncertain Western Europe. Even those former Soviet satellites that are now free, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the rest, feel nervous about the emerging Russo-German hegemony in their region and not very helpful about retaining American protection, as the 2009 letter from 17 distinguished East European leaders made eloquently clear. And then finally, there is the grumbling appendix of Russia itself. The blunt truth that no Foreign Office wants to face is that Europe is incapable of solving these problems on its own, and it has shown so in the last 10 years. It is divided too evenly on the Turkish, Ukrainian, and Russian questions. It has no agreed policy on how to obtain a real revival of Europe's economies. It is paralyzed in general. Someone else's leadership will be required to cut Europe's many Gordian knots. In the similar moment of continental paralysis in the 1950s, Anthony Eden hit upon the idea, in his bath, it is supposedly said, of using the West European Union, a modest institution neglected after the birth of NATO, to bring Bonn into the Western security system over French objections to German rearmament. That decision, on which Eden acted, led in time to full German participation in NATO, then to a revived Europe, then to the Treaty of Rome, and finally to the long post-war economic boom resting as it had to upon a secure Western alliance. Is there an equivalent in today's world to the WEU of the 1950s? Perhaps there is. In 2007, President Bush, Chancellor Merkel, and the EU Commission President Manuel Barroso agreed on small steps to create a North Atlantic Economic Union. That grand title concealed a very modest reality. Roughly speaking, this was an agreement to smooth over regulatory disputes which were growing between America and Europe. But there is reason to believe that Bush hoped for more from it, and that more might now be more appealing to the battered duo of Merkel and Barroso, who are in much more difficult straits than they were in 2007. Suppose then that this original modest reality of an Atlantic Economic Union were to be expanded into a more ambitious version that united the US and the EU certainly, but that also admitted those European countries not in the European Union. And by that I don't simply mean Norway and Switzerland, but also Turkey, Ukraine, Georgia, ultimately perhaps even Russia. Might that not begin to solve some of the intractable problems that Europe has so far failed to solve? Consider briefly its potential advantages. I imagine it would not offer free movement of labour, open immigration, which frightens France and Germany. So that would solve the Turkish problem. But while giving the Turks something less than free movement, it would also give them, and Georgia and Ukraine, membership of the largest free trade area in the world. And one might add that one could add a degree of immigration preference. Might those things not be compensation for any hurt Muslim feelings at not entering the EU proper? Unlike the EU, moreover, this union would pose no threat to the sovereignty of any of its member states. It would not have an acquis communautaire, it would not have the supranational elements we know of from the EU. In those circumstances, some current members of the EU, notably ourselves, might prefer to leave and join this new expression of wider, but not deeper, Atlantic solidarity. It would provide an early forum for the US and the EU to settle their recurrent regulatory wars when they're still at the level of skirmishes. And finally, it would not offer any military threat to Russia, and might in time offer an entry into the institutions of Atlantic governments to a Russia that had finally shed its nostalgia for empire. And this is what I might call a variable geometry Atlanticism. And it would open all kinds of possibilities for a paralyzed and stagnant Western Europe. If Britain could alter its relationship with the EU in such a body, such a wider body, so there would be a corresponding opportunity for the Union for themselves, also within the Atlantic Economic Union, without us getting constantly in the way. Above all, just as the Marshall Plan and NATO provided the economic and security underpinnings of the long post-war Western prosperity, so an AEU might provide the springboard of stability and confidence for an economic rival on both sides of the Atlantic, in a climate that is currently recessionist and discouraging. Now, I'm being very grand and casual here about redrawing the map of the world. If this is ever to be a realistic proposition, my advocacy won't be enough. It will have to be taken up by major political figures, including major American leaders, ideally both political parties. That's far from impossible. There's a hunger in America, as elsewhere, for a new politics that offers promise and hope, and not simply endless austerity. President Obama and Governor Romney might both be prepared to look favourably on anyone who provided them with such an initiative, even against State Department prejudices, if they thought that it had any chance of getting serious support in Europe. It was, after all, Anthony Eden who saved the day in 1953, not John Foster Dulles. My third point is, who is to be today's Anthony Eden? Plainly, the only candidates for this role are in the Tory party. For practical reasons, there are two, David Cameron and William Hague. Both have their good and bad points. But William Hague wins on the point that matters most. We sense that, I believe we sense, that ultimately Hague would be prepared to leave the European Union, either because some sort of Atlantic Economic Union offered us more advantages, including the restoration of our independence, or because in negotiations our European partners refuse not only this new structure of power, but also any serious concessions within a purely EU context. David Cameron has repeatedly made it plain that he is wholly opposed to leaving the European Union and cannot imagine himself doing so. I take him at his word. In my view, we have to regard him as an opponent, rather than as an ally on these questions. On the other hand, that's true for William Hague. On the other hand, David Cameron won't be around forever. And as we saw when Mrs. Thatcher fell, a lot can change when a leader changes. I believe it essential, however, to have a leader who is determined on the issue of regaining a serious measure of independence, in particular in the context of having a referendum. I do not favour a referendum until we have actually left the European Union and remained outside it for a number of years. I think we have every justification on the basis of past practice to go to the country saying we will negotiate in good faith, but we are prepared to leave if necessary, to then leave if the negotiations produce no such good effect, to do so on the basis that the parliamentary election had given us that authority, and then, after a period, we would also promise this, after a period we would announce that enough time had elapsed for us to be able, for the people to judge on the basis of reality, rather than the basis of promises and criticisms, that we would then hold a referendum. We might build some timescale into any legislation. But it is very important not to find that we have advocated a referendum rather than a policy of regaining our independence. It is regaining our independence which is the key point here. Whether we do it wholly or mainly, whether we do it through a referendum or by negotiations conducted by a new government. But that is the key point. My final point, therefore, is one of timing. Last week, my actuary told me that my life expectancy is approximately 14 years. Well, I thought to myself cheerfully, I have a sporting chance of living to see a Conservative government in office. For it would take a Tory government either to take full advantage of the kind of Atlantic possibilities I sketched here today, or if they turn out to be another road not taken, another failed concept, then it will fall on them to lead Britain out of the coils of the European lagoon by some method or other. In the meantime, say not the struggle naught availeth. In politics as in life, the struggle is 9 points to follow.